What is the science of reading? What are leaders doing to accelerate reading achievement? We answer these questions and more in Science of Reading Leadership, Guiding Minds, Transforming Lives, powered by Just Right Reader. Get ready for an exciting new series as we explore the latest research you need to know as you kick off the new school year. Welcome to another episode of the Science of Reading Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Terry Hunt, and today we are here to have a conversation with Dr. Sonia Cabell. Her bio is so amazing, but what you really need to know is that she is an associate professor of reading education in the School of Teacher Education and the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University. And she has a focus and a heart for early literacy. Let me just get into it and first say thank you, Dr. Sonia, for being here. I'm excited to hear from you, and I'm grateful that you took the time.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, I have a question for you, right? We're going back to school. Everybody's going back to school. And so the conversation is always centered around, what do we do this summer? How do we prepare for the school year? And before we get into all of the research stuff, you used to teach second grade. You used to be in the classroom. Second grade was like my heart space. I love early literacy, so I love how the light bulbs come on for kindergartners and things like that. But second grade, that's like the sweet spot. So I want you to think back to your time going back to the school year. What were some of the things that you could think about or the things that were going through your mind? Do you have a funny story or a fun story about back to school?
Well, I agree with you. I love second grade. I think second graders are special. It's a special time where you can do so much with them. They're independent in so many ways, but they love school. They love their teacher. They're so excited to come back. They're begging for things like homework. I also was a reading coach in K through 3 back in the reading first days, and thinking about going back to school from a teacher's perspective. Like when I was a classroom teacher, I, was just thinking about how do I make a welcoming and warm environment for my students so they feel safe with me, that they feel like they can learn, they want to learn. I really wanted them to not only learn, I wanted them to love learning. And I especially loved teaching reading. I wanted them to love reading. And so I was really concerned with the books that I had on my shelf and exposing them to a lot of different wonderful books and wonderful learning opportunities. So that was always kind of at the forefront for me. And then when I was a reading coach, I would spend time in meeting with teachers to really understand their needs as they enter the classroom. So I think the beginning of the year is a real special time.
It is. It's such a special time. I remember when I would be going back to the classroom or when I would be going back for the school year, one of the things that I was not good at is like decorating my classroom, right? I love teaching. Reading is my superpower. Literacy instruction is my superpower. I would love all of that. I would be excited about it. But I would lay in bed at night like, did I put enough things on my bulletin board? Are they straight? Because it just wasn't my thing. But every time I would see the kids and they would never point out the crooked letters on my board, it would just go all the way and I would be ready for it. So
yeah, kids are so forgiving, right? Aren't they? Like I would be teaching them how to, I don't have very good handwriting myself, but I was teaching them a cursive letter. I think it might have been H. I forgot which letter it was, but I said to them, I know you could do it better than I can. And one of my second graders said, oh no, Mrs. Cabell, you do everything the best. It's perfect.
They're so sweet.
They're so sweet.
It's like you want to just say to them, can you walk around with me forever? Just be my fan club. I love it. So prevention of early reading difficulties, these small shifts that we can do. Can you summarize for us, just kind of summarize these findings and why you believe that this could be a really significant impact on educators as they go back to school this year?
Yes. So I love that you said small shifts. And that is, what I want to talk about today is how do you have these small marginal shifts in your instructional practice, or how do you encourage teachers to have these shifts in their practice that um, don't take over their whole lives, right? But rather, how do I make a marginal shift in what I'm already doing to maximize, the impact on students? And one of those areas where teachers can do that is by thinking about and being aware of the kinds of conversations they're having back and forth with their students. So having those back and forth conversations really matter for children's language learning. And it's not just any conversation, right? It is conversations that are responsive to what students are saying. So when you think about being a responsive partner, you're thinking about expanding on what students are saying, extending what they're saying, and then asking them a question that would relate to what they're saying to push them even further, helping them to, use language and so that they can grow in those language. Some of my own research has shown that that encouraging that back and forth exchanges for 4 or more turns, and by a turn I just mean where the speaker changes. So I'm saying something that's 1 turn, you say something that's a 2nd turn, I say something that's a 3rd turn, and so forth. But encouraging teachers to have conversations that go beyond 4 turns, and encouraging children to use more language. And that can really help their language and vocabulary growth.
I love that. Now, I actually want to stay right there because something that you just said as you finished it is it helps their vocabulary and their
Mm-hmm.
comprehension. So, can
Mm-hmm.
you talk to us a little bit about what that research finding really highlights? And how does that striving for 5, how does that back
Mm-hmm.
and forth, how does that impact that language and that literacy and that comprehension? Why are those two things so intertwined?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of reasons those things are intertwined, but one of them that my research points to is about um, how we can build children's knowledge or science and social studies knowledge, and the kinds of conversations we're having around those science and social studies topics. They tend to be different than the other kinds of conversations that we're having. In a science context, for example, teachers tend to use vocabulary they wouldn't use otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to ask inferential types of questions that they might not ask otherwise. The same thing is true when you're reading certain books. The book could be about content, for example, rich book, an informational text, or a mixed genre text that has both information and a story. And the kinds of talk that teachers and children engage in with one another during certain contexts like this is different. And so in school, we're really trying to help students practice and learn the formal language register of written language. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference between the conversation you and I are just having right now as college educated adults, and the language of books.
Mm-hmm.
The language of books and written language is a lot more complex. It's more complex in its vocabulary and in its sentence structure. And so we want to really have conversations that promote the formal language register. And one way to do that is through using the content areas and thinking about the conversations I have during my content area instruction. And this might be one reason why we're finding that content rich literacy approaches, or approaches that integrate content and literacy instruction, are having an impact on children's vocabulary and comprehension rather than traditional siloed types of approaches.
That is amazing. Like as you started to say it, I started thinking, oh, it is so true. When I'm having a conversation with my child about her day at school, it's much different than when we start having a conversation about our homework or
Right.
about what she's reading in her science textbooks. I mean, just yesterday, she was listening to a conversation between her father and I, and she was like, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? Well, why did you say it like that? And our stopping to have that dialogue and
Mm-hmm.
explain those concepts, it just really, what you're saying now really brings it together like, okay, that's what we're building so that when she sees it in context in print, now there's a foundation to it. There's some weight to it, so to speak. So when you think about this, right, as we're going back and you talk about those small shifts,
Hmm.
What kind of support or training can administrators provide to help teachers who have that more siloed, sage on the stage, one way conversation style? How can they support teachers in shifting them towards a more engaged conversation like you're sharing and talking about?
Hmm. I think that this does take some practice for teachers, because as human beings, it's difficult to shift the nature of how we interact with other people just by somebody saying shift how you interact with people. In fact, research earlier in my career that was led by Dr. Laura Justice, who was my dissertation advisor back in the day. We found that if you just train teachers to be conversationally responsive partners, kind of across all settings, and this
Mm-hmm.
was for preschool teachers, it was difficult for them they were having more conversations, but it was difficult for them to do the more advanced moves of really modeling more advanced language for students. And so my work with Dr. Tricia Zucker from the University of Texas Houston Medical Center, we've engaged in this kind of work for the past 15 or so years, and we have written a book called Strive for Five Conversations. And the Strive for Five just means you strive for five turns in a conversation, just like we were talking earlier. That really is the teacher, child, teacher, child, teacher. That's a five-turn conversation. But you'd be surprised that most conversations in classrooms are only three turns. The teacher asks a question, the child says something, and the teacher says, "Good job," and then it moves to somebody else. Or the teacher asks a question, the child gets it wrong, and the teacher's looking for another child to get it right. And that's, and that's no shame on teachers. That is a normal way of us interacting. But if you just take some of those conversations and lengthen those with those individual children and have a one-on-one conversation, even in a group setting,
Mm-hmm.
where you strive for five, you are building on what that child says and improving their language, but then also others around them will know that's the routine of what you're doing, and will understand that you might have a conversation a few seconds later that lasts for five conversational turns with them as well. So we wrote that book in order to say, here's a framework you can use, and then try it in a very specific context. Try it in the book reading context, like after reading aloud. And we wrote this book for preschool through first grade teachers. Teachers in second grade and above are telling me that these ideas are useful to them as well. But you want to think about what are the discussions you're having in the after reading section of your read aloud, and think about using this technique there. So that we recommend narrowing in on a particular context. Yeah, and I think that teachers at first will need support in order to, from instructional coaches and such. A lot of people have reached out to me saying that they're doing book studies of our book, and so I'm hoping that it'll be helpful for teachers and administrators as they start to use this practice.
Yeah, I can imagine that because I'm even thinking about how many turns I take when I know I have a lesson to teach and I have things that I have to get through. Like, how many turns do I take? But that specific piece of advice of use it during the after reading discussion, I think
Mm-hmm.
that even guides us so that we're more intentional about where we're going to even have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We're more intentional about being focused there. And then even in our lesson planning, we can start to say, okay, when I ask this question, what am I going to make sure that I don't do or that I
Yeah.
do when the child responds or when the child answers?
That's exactly right. I think after teachers are doing, and teachers might find I do this quite regularly already, which is great. And if they're already doing it in the book reading context, then we challenge them, pick another context of your
Yeah.
day, with your STEM context, or or even at recess, the kinds of conversations you have, or in small group, whatever the context is, then focus on that one and see, how can I change to add this to my toolkit? Every conversation doesn't have to be a strive for five conversation, but we are encouraging that you add this, that teachers, add this to their toolkit and of the kinds of conversations they're having.
This episode is brought to you by Just Right Reader. Extend phonics instruction, strengthen home and school partnerships, and accelerate reading achievement with Take Everywhere decodable packs from Just Right Reader. Personalized Take Everywhere packs makes phonics fun and accessible for families. Every book comes with a video phonics lesson and writing pages to help readers reinforce their decoding and writing skills. To learn more, visit justrightreader.com. Family engagement also is becoming like a really important piece of this work, right? We're hearing more and more about wraparound services and making sure that we bring in community support, bring in caregivers, bring in parents, all of us working together. So how do we take this Strive for 5, that higher level engagement with our students? How do we now bring parents into that conversation? And how do we help parents understand what that looks like? It's not just asking a question, getting an answer. What is it? How do we help them understand what that conversation looks like?
Yeah, and parents are children's first and most important teachers, right?
Yeah.
Just like you were saying earlier, your child was listening to what the conversation was and engaging in that. And I think that helping parents to understand that talking is teaching is important. Because it's, the language that children are developing from birth matters to their whole course of development, not just to reading and literacy, but to everything. And we learn that that language through the multitude of interactions that we have. So having those kinds of conversations with children are important. Just because the child is now entering preschool or kindergarten or first grade doesn't mean those conversations lose importance. That's still the method through which they're learning the language, along with some other pieces, but they're learning language through those interactions. It doesn't just change because they've entered school. So teachers can really be very powerful in partnering with parents, because parents will trust the teacher, and parents tend to want to partner with teachers. And knowing that they're in it together is helpful. One of the things that we've done, that Dr. Trisha Zucker and I have done, it's weird calling her Dr. Trisha Zucker. She's just Trisha to me. We taught together. When I was a reading coach, she was my kindergarten teacher.
What?
Yeah,
that is so cool.
And we've done a journey together. We did our doctoral work together, and then we've been researching together. So she's a real special person. She's one of the best friends I've ever had. She's a real special person to me that I've known for what year is this one? We met about 20 years ago.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, but anyway, one of the things that we do in the studies that she leads is that teachers send home like a bracelet, like a paper bracelet that asks a question. You can also do text messages to parents if you use a tool like Remind. You can also have a sticker at the end of the day that's a kind of like a question prompt, encouraging parents to talk. And you can do that. Think about whether that could be helpful to you to engage the parents. Also, parent workshops. Not all parents will attend workshops, but parent workshops also can be very successful. So I think that really the power of the teacher partnering with the parent is very, very important.
We have prompting guides, right? As teachers, we have prompting guides. If a child miscues here, this is how you can support them. And as you were talking about the bracelet, I was like, oh, wow, it would be really cool if you sent home like a little prompting guide with parents that says you can ask this question about their day. And then when they say this, follow it up by asking this question, just like a fun way to keep that conversation going.
Right.
Another game that I used to play with my oldest all the time is In Other Words. I don't know. I think I saw it on some show somewhere. And basically I would say a word and then she would say another word and I would say, okay, in other words. And we would have these back and forth to see who could say synonyms back and forth. and see who could go the longest.
That's great.
You know? So anything like that, I think
Hmm.
those are great things that we can help with that conversation, bringing that dialogic conversation.
And really, parents understanding that, again, talking is teaching, that they are teaching, and just engaging them in conversations regularly is
Yeah.
teaching. And sometimes, just like my 9-year-old has to remind me to put away the phone, stop paying
Mm,
attention to the phone, sometimes we just have to put away our phones and just engage in that conversation. I find it as a parent increasingly difficult with the phone because, like a lot of people, I'm addicted to my phone. I don't want to let it go. Even my son this morning on the way to school, he's a fourth grader. He said, he was saying, Mommy, don't pick up your phone to text. You shouldn't be doing that while you're driving. I'm like, you're absolutely right. I would never want you to do that. And I would want us to be safe. But it just reminds me of how attached we are to our phones. Um, and so figuring out when do I have time that we're just talking, I'm not distracted
yeah.
because I'm easily distracted by my phone or my computer.
Yeah. This has been such a great conversation. I have a couple more questions for you because I want to think about this in the long term, right? A lot of times we adopt things
Hmm.
when we believe that there is a long term implication for it. So,
Right.
can you tell me, in your mind's eye, how do you see this conversation, this really working to make sure that kids become robust literacy lovers of language, right?
Hmm.
When you have that perspective, what's the long term implication on education, on this science of reading research?
Hmm.
What are the long term implications of adopting this way of interacting with students in your classroom?
Yeah, I love this question because this is the heart of it. When I was a second grade teacher, I didn't understand how important language development is to children's literacy and to their reading, to their writing later on. So a lot of times you have the case where a child reaches third grade or fourth grade, and all of a sudden you thought they were fine. They were fine on all their metrics, but then they don't understand what they're reading. And you're saying, what happened? Well, along the way, they might not have been building the language skills as well as the background knowledge that they need to be able to understand those texts that they get that when they become increasingly
Mm,
harder. So if we're not introducing them to the language of those books and texts, the written language, if we're not building their knowledge and building their language skills, how are they going to really understand those things? So that needs to start right from the beginning, and that's a long game. So when we think about reading as being both about fluent word recognition as well as language comprehension, okay, if we're thinking about both of those things, this is really where the language comprehension pieces fit in. We think about like Hollis Scarborough's rope from 2001, that you need both of that, the word recognition as well as the language comprehension pieces. And the language comprehension pieces include the background knowledge we need. It includes the verbal reasoning, the abstract thinking. It includes the structures of language. It includes vocabulary. And so it also includes understanding the different genres of text that are at play, like whether it's narrative or informational. But all of those things take time to build, and they will affect later comprehension. But
yeah.
we don't always see it because we don't always have the best measures to measure it along the way. They don't. It's not as easy to measure as the alphabet knowledge, for example.
Yeah.
However, it's still important in building along the way. So if you neglect that,
Hmm.
then there's a whole piece of reading and writing that they're going to have a problem with. So that, to me, what underlies everything is the oral language. It even underlies the word recognition. So if I come to a word I don't know, if I don't already have it in my mental lexicon, in my oral language, how am I going to be able to decode it or understand what it means? Right. So those pieces, language undergirds the word recognition as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I can only imagine that once I get into these conversations and I really develop these very robust linguists in my classroom, right? it's going to add more time and just more stuff in my classroom. And then there's all the other things that we have to take into account in our educational day. So how do you recommend that educators balance this adoption of new research, balance this adoption of striving for five, all of the things, letters, all the things that we're learning?
Mm-hmm.
How do we bring it all together and really balance it so that we're not feeling overwhelmed or we're not even feeling paralyzed by all the things that we have to do?
Yeah, I think at first some things are a heavy lift, right?
Yeah.
First, learning something new or learning to change a practice is hard. For example, let's take weight loss, for example. When I was first losing weight, it was a really hard shift for me. I had to think about everything I was eating. I had to really pay attention. And then after a while, things became more routine for me as I began to kind of master what do I need to eat in order to lose weight. It's not that it became easy all of a sudden, but it became so much easier than I thought it was going to be. So in the same way, if you bring on a new skill, such as I want to have Strive for Five conversations in my classroom, and again, narrowly focus that, it then can represent a marginal shift in something you're already doing. So it's not like layering a new curriculum over what you're already doing. It is, how do I take what I'm already doing and make it stronger? And how do I start small in one area and learn to do it in that area so that it becomes routine? And what I find is across my day, for example, with my own son, but what I find is that I'm naturally doing these language modeling techniques and building on what he's saying and being a responsive partner because it's become routine and it's just what I do. So in the same way, teachers, this can become second nature to teachers, but it'll take some practice at first. And you can also enlist other teachers to help you make that practice. Observe you. You might observe yourself on video of a conversation, like a 5-minute chunk of time. And you might ask somebody else to and say, okay, how can I make this better? Or, how many conversation turns did I have? That sort of thing. So I would say, don't let any one of these things kind of take over your life, but rather, how do I make a shift? Because a small shift you make now pays dividends for years.
Yeah. You said asking someone to critique or watch you, and I'd be like, can you keep track of how many turns that I have?
Yeah, you could keep track on your fingers, right? And so that's what, in fact, counting conversational turns is a very easy way to do it on your fingers. So striving for 5 conversational turns. So the teacher asks a question, the child responds, the teacher says something, either scaffolds them upward to make more challenge or scaffolds downward if the answer that they gave was incorrect, partially correct, scaffolds downward to provide more support. And the child responds, that same child, and then the teacher responds. That's it. That's the Strive for 5.
That is huge. I mean, it's such a simple shift, but when you think about the impact that it can have, it's beautiful. And then also I think about the social and emotional part, right? That child now feeling seen. Mm-hmm. That child now going, oh, she really listened. Oh, he really listened.
Exactly. So there's a socio-emotional component in language interactions that can't be separated out. We're not just having a conversation to build language. We're having a conversation to learn something, to support each other, to just cooperate. We're having conversations for purposes. Not, but language is one of those things we're building as we have these conversations. So it's really hard to separate out the socio-emotional from that language learning. In a Strive for 5, you're telling the child, I see you. I care about what you're saying. I want you to be successful. I'm going to help you be successful. I'm not just going to go to a different person if you get it wrong. So you're absolutely right that there is this responsive and warm and component that we need as part of human development.
Yeah. And then just to piggyback even a little bit more, when a child knows that you're leaning into their answer, they're more intentional and thoughtful about their response also.
Right? A good point.
Because
it's a very good point.
Then they know what I say she's going to build on what I say. So
Mm-hmm.
she's either going to scaffold down or she's going to scaffold up. They might not have that language,
Yes.
but am I being authentic in my response? Am I really saying what I know? Am I being intentional? Am I really thinking about my response in this moment? Because I know she's listening and she's going to respond accordingly.
I love that. I would love to study that with young children somehow, on what they're thinking as in the Strive for Five classroom. What are they thinking? I love that piece of it, because are they more engaged with the conversation because they know that it's going to have that sort of cadence to it? I would love to, figure out how we can get into the minds of those children to figure
Wouldn't
that out.
that be amazing?
Yes, it would. I think we could do that with, I think first graders, we could probably do it with a kind of a think aloud uh, prompt or some sort of survey, like an interview. I'll have to think about that, but thanks for that idea.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So as we get ready to close, I just want to make sure that I ask you, what additional advice do you have for teachers as they really navigate this school year, as they jump full force in? Is there any additional advice that you might have for them?
I just have praise for teachers. Thank you for what you do for administrators. Thank you for what you do for children every day. As a parent, I think about how we entrust our children, our most precious, the most precious people to us, our children, into the care of loving and kind teachers and administrators every day. The warmth and caring that you have for children matters so much. You might not realize how much that matters, but that matters so much to their development. So I would encourage teachers to really lean into getting to know their students and building those relationships with students as they do every year. And just my hats off to teachers. It's one of the most noble professions.
Well, Dr. Cabell, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
being here. I am so grateful. This was such a fun conversation. This was great, packed with amazing insights, great research. And I feel like I'm ready to go back to the classroom. Even though I'm not in the classroom anymore, I feel like every time I have these conversations, I'm like, oh, I'm ready. I have new tools. Let me go find the classroom again. But thank you to all of you who are listening. Thank you for leaning in. Continue to do all that you do for our students. And until next time, happy reading. Thanks for joining us. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. We will see you next time on Science of Reading Leadership, Guiding Minds, Transforming Lives.